Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you today, and I am honored and humbled with this incredible panel to be here to discuss the cultural challenges that are presented before us. As mentioned, I'm the Reverend Dr. Derrick McQueen of St. James Presbyterian Church, and I also work for the Center on African American Religion and Sexual Politics at Columbia University as its assistant director. We've been doing work for the past 10 years working within the Black church community. And the Black church community in America consists of maybe 7 Black church historical denominations, including Baptist, AME, and the Church of God in Christ. And in that, we have been trying to figure out how to have conversation with folks in community about what is it exactly about African Americans and African American religion that has the stigma that sexuality and homosexuality and LGBT rights and inclusion is something that is negatively looked upon. And in those conversations, we have seen a major shift throughout our country, a major shift throughout our churches, and a major shift throughout the world. But it doesn't just only work with and stem from African American experience. It stems from several different kinds of understandings of experiences in many different cultures. I've worked with folks who are, I work with Buddhists, I work with Jewish folk, I work with Asians, I work with Muslim queers here in the US. And I am amazed that although all of our faith traditions seem to be so dissimilar, that there is a similarity actually when we start to talk about the cultural notions of inclusion and sexuality. But let me start with this by saying that the parameters of culture are subconsciously defined by religious ideals of the community, whether that religion is engaged in or not. The parameters of culture very often translate into the language here in the Americas, where we say the Black community is shaped by Black church, and it is shaped by the teachings, the learnings, not just the biblical and sacred textual learnings, but several other kinds of things that I'll get to in just a little bit. But we are shaped by Black church politics in our communities. And in working with several other different communities of cultures and denominations and religions, I found that those cultural parameter subconscious shifts are something that is very similar throughout. In his book, Spirit in the Dark, by Dr. Joseph Surratt of Columbia University, he does an incredible analysis of Black literary and cultural movements of the 20th century. And I think in the introduction, it says that most times that those works are thought of as secular and at times profane, but Dr. Surratt demonstrates how religion was actually a dominant force in such works through the 1920s, the 1930s, 1960s. Religion, regardless of faith, does shape the inner and perceived politics of culture. In some ways, and this is what I meant when I was saying I'll get to this a little bit later, in some ways, religion and faith and the way that it shapes the community, it teaches coping mechanisms for oppression. It also fortifies perseverance and a faith-based can-do attitude, while also helping to define cultural respectability politics, which, strangely enough, conversely, actually somehow justifies the prejudices, stigma, and violence of LGBT persons. When LGBT persons are told that they no longer have access points to these strategies woven within the understanding of the religious capacity, we are seeming bereft of that capacity and are left to struggle on our own, even against the places from which we've come to declare our own identities and our own sanctity. I do remember very clearly one moment when I was working with a group of gentlemen who were trying to figure out how they could justify and they were wrestling with their sexuality and their denomination. And I had an epiphany myself. And I realized that no matter what, in all of my religious upbringing that I never had a doubt that I was loved by the divine source, that I was loved by God, that I was loved by the creator, that I was part of that divine creation. And upon realizing that, I then realized that it was the layers that was built upon the church religion and the ways of respectability of understanding oneself in church that actually was trying to close the door on me. But that understanding of my own self-perception of divinity is what actually kept my foot in the door and helped me to continue to keep that struggle going. The cultural challenges, when we are culturally, especially if you're a minority in a majority situation, or even if you're in a minority in a country in which you are a majority, but the religion perceives you as a minority within your own religious home, your sense of self and your sense of family and your sense of where do I belong is very, very palpable and very powerful. I work with a wonderful, wonderful woman who's an Asian academic, a religious academic, and she has done much work and much writing and much self-contemplation. We've had many conversations around this academically about the similarities between our cultures and how we build our relationships with our family, and how we build our relationships with our elders, and how we build our relationships with the elders of our elders. And when we think about cultural family dynamics, there is a hierarchy in family in terms of the elders. And whether or not we are revolutionaries and sort of step out and when we're younger, there's a way that we try to get that respectability back and get back within the family and back within that hierarchy and within the stable of what that means. And we struggle. The challenges are in our family, we struggle to figure out how we can get back in to the hierarchy of that strategy of what family is. And emotionally and psychically, it is powerfully painful to have the door closed on you. And many different cultures understand this. And I want to say it in this way. In many different cultures, we have a tendency to think of ourselves as a group of people that need one another and need the touchstone of our cultures in order to move forward and in order to understand our full identity. And in doing that, we must be very cognizant of the fact that if we do not have that and we don't have access to that, then who are we? And we have to figure out how to define who we are all over again. And that is a hard road to travel. But then when you find that you still have a yearning for your faith tradition, a deep yearning for your faith tradition, it becomes an even stronger uphill battle to figure out how you are going to include yourself with that capacity of faith and strength and perseverance when it is actually something that is told that you cannot have. So you fight and you struggle and you justify and you look at your sacred text and you try to see yourself in the sacred text. And that becomes even countercultural. So the inclusion that we very often seek and very often find, even within our most sacred of texts, becomes countercultural. And the other thing that I found with being a minority in America is that when we are countercultural to our own texts and to our own communities who have struggled through oppression with the same religion that we're struggling through now. They don't want to accept that new minority. The LGBT community would be, quote unquote, the new minority in the civil rights struggle. And who wants to align themselves with that struggle once again? But most of our texts and most of our religious and cultural notions call for us to take care of those who are in need. I think the challenges, as I stated at the beginning, and I'll end this so that we can have our panel discussion as well, is really seriously in that the parameters of culture are subconsciously defined by religious ideals of community. Whether that religion is engaged in or not, the community soaks in those religious ideals and they become the building blocks for culture. And those challenges of dismantling those building blocks, that is one of the major cultural challenges of the LGBT community in religious and church and synagogues and mosques and other religious communities all throughout the world. Thank you for allowing me to have this time with you, and I look forward to this discussion.